Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. My guest today is Carolyn Birrell, and she is the author of Walking with Faye, a book about her mother's uncharted path into dementia. I've wanted to talk about dementia for a very long time, so I'm very excited to be having this conversation today. And Carolyn's writing began as a way to help her make sense of what was happening, and it quickly turned into the book she herself had needed to provide relatable caregiving help. It is a beautiful, empowering book, and I would recommend that anybody read it, whether or not dementia is part of your life or not. It's beautiful, and I really loved it. So welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And I just want to say, first of all, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, but I'm so grateful to you that you shared the story, because it is such a powerful narrative that you've written, and it is such a gift that you have given us.
Thank you. I was certainly blindsided. I think I did all of the things that most people do when they're starting to notice things about their loved one whose behaviors are changing, and that was ignore it. I rationalized it away for years, and in the early stages of dementia, you're able to do that because the person who's affected isn't overcome by the disease all at once. It kind of trickles in, and you have little tiny episodes and examples of things that are happening that just don't quite fit with their usual personality that you're used to.
It did actually, I have to say, it stunned me how long you were in denial. Because, I don't know whether it's because I'm in this field, of older people and dealing with midlife issues, but I'm finely tuned to people's memories and what they can do or can't do. And if they say something strange, I'm really finely tuned to that. And it surprised me that you spent so long in denial, although from what you wrote, to me, it was like, it just seemed obvious. Although I don't know what was going on for you, that was it just too difficult to acknowledge?
I think a number of things were happening. Hindsight, of course, is the strongest precursor, but it was my mother, and my mother had, an authoritative hold on me. So she was able to say things that were off just a click, and I could say to myself, well, that mom's getting quirky in her old age. And that's the thing about dementia. It doesn't come on. It comes in waves, like I described in my book. A small episode of forgetting a birthday that she was easily able to explain away. Another episode of not remembering to pay a bill that she could say, oh, was it lost in a stack of papers and I couldn't find that bill? Or I did send it, they made the mistake. And I think with dementia, the person who is starting to notice it about themselves, they quickly explain it away. It's actually a proven behavior that the person notices something's wrong, doesn't want to take a look at it, so they explain it away. And then the loved one, me being the daughter, I was readily willing to accept those answers because I myself didn't want to deal with what might be going on, and I had no experience with dementia.
And what was it that changed it? When did things shift that you realized that this was not right?
It kind of came in another wave, more than one thing. I was awakened very early in the morning. It was dark out on the West Coast by an East Coast sheriff who had called me to tell me that he had gotten my number and he was receiving reports that my mother was driving erratically on the wrong side of the road. She nearly hit someone, and he had received more than one call. For me, I was shocked, and all I could think was, number one, I'm not awake, and number two, I'm 3,000 miles away. I just spoke with my mother yesterday, and she sounded perfectly fine, told me she had gone to church. So my response was, well, can you do something? Pull her over. I know my mother. She's not going to take a phone call from me saying, Mommy, but you're driving erratically. She's not going to receive that well. And right behind that, I received a phone call from the Department of Family Health and Services. And that was a very angry, pointed phone call toward me from a woman who had been assigned my mother's caseworker because she had fallen. They had taken her to the hospital, and as they got her stabilized, she couldn't identify anyone to come pick her up. So the nurse was assigned, the caseworker, and she escorted my mother to her house and saw the living conditions my mother was in, and I hadn't been there for a year. The living conditions she described were just terrible. She had been punching a hole in the bottom of a chicken broth can and drinking it. She was in the dark. She was in a mess. She didn't have clean clothes. Her kitchen was in total disarray. And this woman pointedly said to me, what kind of daughter would let their mother live in these conditions? And that was my shock.
And I would say you're one of three. It wasn't just you, was it? Your siblings had also not been there and had not seen what was going on. And that it's classic for so many of us where we are so far away from our older relatives, and it's not easy to get there, especially when you're living on opposite sides of the country.
Especially when your mother is regaling you with stories of, she made a pan of lasagna for her neighbor, and she was picking tomatoes out of her garden and bringing them to church because she had so many. And she was taking her daily walks and chatting with all the neighbors she saw along the route. And I came to find out none of these things were happening, but these were our morning conversations that I listened to every day and fully believed because she was so convincing. She had these stories developed. She hadn't been to church in over a year.
I remember that was so shocking, actually, when I read that.
Yeah.
And when you arrived and started making inquiries and finding out what had been going on, and that you found this, that it was a complete and utter fiction.
Yeah.
And did you challenge her on the fiction?
No, because you don't challenge my mother. My mother, was the authoritative figure in my life. She loved me, but she also was the taskmaster. She raised me not to ask those questions. She raised me to be obedient, and I was. I had utmost respect for her. When I did visit her, I would shut myself in the bathroom as quickly as I could and clean until she was rapping on the door, telling me she knew what I was doing in there and to come out. I couldn't clean her kitchen for her because she would admonish me to leave everything alone. Don't touch my things. Why are you coming here and doing this? Let's just have a nice visit. There's nothing wrong with my kitchen. So I was repeatedly told these things over the years as I watched things slide downhill. And I told myself, well, my mother's getting older. Her housekeeping skills are slipping. She's getting feisty in her old age. She gets forgetful. These are things that old people do.
It's so tricky, isn't it, getting that balance right between what is just natural aging and what is something else.
And how much do you interfere?
Yeah.
Can you take something away from your parent when your parent is perfectly capable, from their perspective, of living on their own? I couldn't have changed how she did her banking. She wouldn't let me pay her bills. I couldn't have changed how she drove. It was her car and her keys to the car. I couldn't have taken them away from her because the early stages of dementia don't present themselves in such a solid form. They trickle in, tiny by tiny drips, they trickle in.
And am I right in thinking that you never actually got a formal diagnosis?
That's correct. My mother was what they called non-compliant. So when I did take her to the doctor for her annual checkup, I called ahead and I told them what I was perceiving going on. And when we got there, two different times, they started by saying, "Now, Faye, we're going to assess your cognitive abilities." Well, as soon as she heard that, her jaw jutted out and her lips sealed shut, and she refused to answer any questions.
And had she always been like that, or was this new?
No, this was new. It was pronounced. I think I would always describe my mother as, a little firecracker, a little spitfire, loving, but, zippy. But this was new. She was angrier, more confused, and again, these were the symptoms that were dribbling in. Paranoid, and that's when I started realizing we had something else going on. When she started telling me stories about, a man hanging out at the end of her driveway, watching her house at night. I couldn't believe that. I couldn't, in my mind, say that that was true. But I also couldn't tell her it wasn't true because I wasn't there. So for me to tell my mother it wasn't true would have been calling her a liar. So I tried all of the rationalization techniques that I could and failed on each one. So it wasn't until I moved her to be closer to me that I was inundated with all of the symptoms of early stage dementia.
So, what actually happened? Because the book opens with you writing about how you are preparing to kidnap your mother. I just, well, it's a great book. You need to read it, everybody. But so what did you do?
I had to lie to her because she wouldn't come willingly. I spent a couple of years trying to convince her to move out west, where I had recently retired with my then husband, Sam. And she refused. She had all of the excuses why she needed to stay in Georgia: her church, her friends, her cat, her garden, my brother and sister, who my brother did never came to see her, and my sister managed to get there once a year because she was from New York. So it was a long drive for her to get down and visit my mother, and for that matter, I was a once a year visitor too. Once I had moved out west, so because she wouldn't come to me, and the sheriff had called, and the family services had called, my sister and I devised a plan to meet there, surprise her with an all expenses paid trip to Idaho for the summer to visit. And while my sister drove her home to wait for the airplane to come to land, we cleaned out her house and got it ready for sale, got rid of her car, and drove everything that made it into the U-Haul van 3,000 miles west, unpacked it into another little house that I had purchased for her, and tried to make it look as much like her house in Georgia so that when we flew her there, she would be comfortable and not so upset.
And at that stage, you thought she would still be able to be independent in this other house, didn't you?
She was right up the road. I did this. I did this for 6 months. I met her for breakfast. It was my morning run. I would run to her house, have coffee with her, run back home, try to do as much as I could in the early morning hours of the day, go visit her for lunch, and then go back home, do all the other things I needed to do, and go see her for dinner. And I did this from, from March till October. And during that time, that was the meat of my book. That was when I was searching for help. That was when I was drowning. That was when I joined the Alzheimer's Association meetings every Thursday. That is when I took Prozac that had been prescribed to me by my doctor because I was having what she called outbursts, eruptions, emotional eruptions. I couldn't keep it together. My mother was just firing tennis balls at me left and right, and I didn't know how to respond in a loving way. I made so many mistakes and responded in non-loving ways, you know shouting back at her that I wasn't stealing from her, and rationalizing with her that nobody was coming in at night, and trying to keep her from going down the highway with her grocery bags in her hand. All of the things. She was like herding cats.
It was, you do get the impression from the book, that it was just so hard, so difficult, and what you were wading through treacle, and yes, it was just everything was coming at you all the time. And I think one of the very interesting things at the end of the book, you talk about the lessons that you learned, and the advice you want to give people. And one of the thing that you were doing then was the wrong thing, wasn't it? It's only in hindsight that you learnt how to manage your mother better, because it's not about correcting them. It's about somehow trying to distract them even. It feels a bit like going back to looking after a toddler. There's no point in arguing with a toddler and telling them they've done something wrong sometimes. Or they're screaming. You've just got to distract them and show them something else and get them to think about something else so that they can carry on their journey without staying where they were stuck.
Absolutely. And from that, empathy, enter into the way they see it. And that's so hard to do when somebody is telling you the sky is purple. But once you realize that they have dementia, and if you have your bag of tools, ready, if you've read about it, if you've looked it up online, if you've watched videos, and if you can do that, or read a book, that was what I searched for. I searched the library for books, and it was so hard to find one that was like me. I needed somebody to tell me what it would be like for everyday things, not a celebrity, whose parent they paid to have taken care of, and not a physician or a neuroscientist to tell me how the brain was working. I needed to know what to do when my mother told me I was stealing from her. I needed to know what to do when my mother was stealing from my neighbors from their mailbox. How do you handle that? And I did it wrong. I would insist I wasn't stealing from her. I would yell at her for stealing neighbors' mail. That's not how to do it with a person with dementia.
So how do you do it?
Kind of like you
What do you
said,
do?
distraction is a big one. There's something called therapeutic fibbing. And that would be part of the distraction when my mother would say, I want to go home. I want to go home right now. I would say, and understand, she would say that on a 20-second loop for hours. It was amazing how she wouldn't release that. And after a little while, you find yourself feeling like you're going crazy when that person won't stop that loop. So what I just figured out to do is answer her and say, someone's coming. Dale is coming, your son. He just put in for vacation. He's just waiting to hear. And as soon as he gets approved, he's coming to get you. And when I said that to her, I could see the wind just come out of her sails, and she relaxed and she was happy. And I couldn't believe I had just lied to my mother. She didn't catch me. She didn't punish me. And she was happy again. And so I thought, I'm going to try this again. And I did it over and over again. What's going on with my house? I said, Dale's watching it. Well, who's watching my blueberries? Dale's going out there and he's picking your blueberries for you and he's freezing them. And she was happy again. So I think that's one of the hardest things with a person who is just becoming indoctrinated into the world of dementia is they don't want to go along with it. They don't want to see it their loved one's way and play that game. They want to rationalize it out of them. They want to say, Mom, I sold your house. Remember, we had to pay for the move and you couldn't live there anymore. So we had to sell your house. That is the worst thing you could say to your mother who has dementia, who's fretting about the fact that her house is sitting there and she's not there to take care of it.
I think that's so powerful. And it reminds me of sort of relationship advice? Is it, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy?
That's the other thing
And
about this book. And I have had people say to me, I read this book because my friend suggested it. And I don't have any experience with dementia. I don't know anyone with dementia, but I read it. And I can't believe, just like you just said, Rachel, I can't believe that I came away with a better outlook for this difficult friend of mine or this relationship I'm having. And I'm going to be kinder now. I'm going to be nicer now. I'm going to be more forgiving. I don't need to be right. I ask myself, how do I want this relationship to progress? I want it to be a good one. So what do I need to do?
yeah. Well, it's a great story. You know,
Yeah.
it's a really readable book.
Thank you.
It doesn't read like an instruction manual. It's not just a memoir because you do learn things from it as you're going through it, but it's a very readable book. It's illuminating. It really is. It's because it's so personal. It's such a personal experience, and you there's no holds barred. You know, you talk about the really nitty gritty and how awful it was, and it
Mm-hmm.
must have been terrible. I mean, I can't quite get my head around it. And it went on for years, didn't it? Even when she went into an institution, which was 6 months after you'd moved her to be near you,
Mm-hmm.
she then carried on for a long time, didn't she?
She was moved 3 times, kicked out because her dementia progressed and she was doing things that each care facility wasn't equipped, because I started her in an assisted living facility, which isn't equipped for a dementia situation. It's meant to help somebody live independently with a little assistance. But my mother was
Mm.
starting to show, the dementia side, or was progressing with the dementia side, and she was entering residents' rooms and she was insisting that that quilt was hers, so she was going to take it. That sort of thing, until we got her to the final one, which was the memory care facility. There were more staff available for each resident. They were equipped with memory care training skills, the kinds of things that my mother needed. And I don't think she probably would have done well with in the early days anyway. Again, it's a progression. It's not just, hey, you're diagnosed with diabetes and now you have to take insulin. It's not like that. It's progressively worse. Well, there are 7 stages, and each stage has a list of behaviors that go along with that stage. And you can follow it and really watch your loved one progress into each stage.
Yeah, and you describe those stages, I think, very well. It's very, it's very clear to see
Yeah.
the steady decline.
I put them as
And
chapter headings so that as you read each
yeah,
chapter, you could see examples of what a stage 5 was.
mm. And you had to cope with the pandemic as well, didn't you?
In the end,
What impact did that have?
it was 2020. It was right when, in the United States, individual states were just starting to say, we're closed. Don't come here. You can't fly out and you can't fly in. I think New York was the first one. And I got the phone call in March that my mother had woken up with the side of her face slack, and they had determined it was a stroke and I should come. And it was a couple of weeks before I was ready to go home anyway. I was in Florida for the winter. So I started changing my flight reservations, and everything fell apart. Flights were being canceled. And I went from flight to flight and delays and rerouting for over a week before I was able to get home. They made an exception for me to come in and see my mother in a quarantined room because I had just flown on a plane. I had just come from Florida, which was one of the hot spots at the time. And when I went in and was ready to leave, they told me I couldn't come back. I had no idea that that was going to happen. And for the next week, I was able to FaceTime with her, and they would hold the phone up to her face, and I would look at her, and I would tell her I loved her and get no response. And it was horrifying to have to be separated from my mother like that. And on the 5th day, I received a phone call from a physician there who said, it's looking like we're at the end. And I said, can I please come see my mother? And he was shocked and said, well, of course you should come see your mother. And I said, they haven't let me back in. So he put me on hold. He came back on the line. I was allowed to go back in. I think I drove there with the coffee pot still on the burner. I had sweatpants on. I don't think I had brushed my teeth. And I showed up at that door. And as they were letting me into her room with my gown, my mask, my gloves, my booties on, the same nurse from the week before said, now you know you can't come back after this. This is your last visit. And I looked at her and realized this was the difference between her letting me in that room and not letting me in that room. So I just bobbed my head. She let me in that door, and then I refused to come out. And I spent the next 2 days in that room with my mother, helping her leave. And I was one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, that's the awful thing, isn't it? That you consider yourself lucky. It was so
So
difficult
so
for
many
so many
people lost
people.
their parents during this pandemic and weren't allowed to be there with them. Husbands and wives and daughters and sons, their family, they were behind a door that they were not allowed to come through, and they didn't get to say goodbye. It just breaks my heart. And I'm a lucky one.
Mm. And at what stage did she stop recognizing you?
Probably, well, I think recognition is stage 5, but for her, it was probably 3 years before she died. And I remember that day when she looked at me and said, hello. And I realized right away that she was just saying hello to somebody. And people asked me if I was crushed by that. How horrible for your mother not to recognize you, her daughter. But for me, my mother's whole demeanor changed toward me, and she became nice and
Yeah.
friendly and held conversations. And she was no longer angry with me for a reason she didn't know, but she knew she was angry with me and accusatory. So all of that went away, and I was just this nice lady who brought her a deli sandwich, or a big, beautiful pear one day. And she would sit with me and look through magazines, and we would talk about, pictures on the walls, limited things, but she was a lovely woman.
Because she'd been very mean to you, hadn't she?
Oh,
She'd been really horrible.
she took it all out on me. And then if you look at it, I am the one who disrupted her entire life. I moved her from her home that she was perfectly happy in. I put her in a strange house, in a strange town. I took away her car. I paid all her bills. And in her mind, I was stealing all of her money. Because of all of those things that were happening, I took the power away from her. So the one thing she could do was be mad at me. And that was her way of gaining power back. And I struggle with that. And to me, that is the bottom line reason why I hesitated in the first place on getting involved in all of those details and deciding that I needed to come into her life and manage it. Who's going to accept that willingly?
Now, I know you got a lot of support from the AA groups, which I thought is interesting. It's the Alzheimer's Association as opposed to Alcoholics Anonymous.
And I went to them like I was in AA. I couldn't
Yeah,
wait for Thursday to come.
really.
Yeah.
I mean, that. So I think that's the important thing, isn't it? You've got to connect with people who understand what you're going through.
For me, it was go to that group. If you can, find that group in your town. You can go to the Alzheimer's Association website, and you can put in your zip code or however it is you search in the UK and find a local chapter near you, hopefully. And for me, there between 5 and 10 people that would go on any given day. And to be surrounded by a group of people that were going through very much the same thing that you were, with differences, and be able to give advice, daily living advice, things you shouldn't say, things you should say, who you should call to get her insurance card renewed, who you should call to get help, with any number of things. So finding a care facility when that time came. These people were my lifesavers.
What I find so profound is that despite her being so mean to you and then not knowing you, your love for her was in no way diminished, and your need to be there to express your love was so powerful, wasn't it?
Yes, I felt like a fraud that entire time. I did need to be with my mother. It was an innate need. It was something I couldn't control. I needed to see her. I needed to be sure she was safe. I needed to take care of her. But while I was with her and leading up to it and going home from it, there were days that I hated her. I did not love this woman who was so unlovable and who was being so unloving toward a daughter who always loved her and knew that she always loved me. So there was this paradox. Like, who is this alien who has inhabited my mother's body? Who is in there? But just like I said from the beginning, she would come through once in a while. Like Mother Nature, and I wrote this in the book, Mother Nature had this way of teasing me, or coercing me into making sure I came back, because she would give me these little tidbits of my mother when she was, as I remembered her. She would open her eyes and look at me and say, "Do you remember that time I chased you around the yard while we were finding Easter eggs?" And I would just look at her, and then there's my mom. She's back. And we would chat about that for a few minutes. And then you could see her just kind of change her facial expression and the set of her jaw. And she would ask me what I had done with her pension check. And I knew she was gone. And here, hold on, because here come the tennis balls.
And was that before the last 3 years, or was that within the last 3 years?
It was
Did you
before.
get any flashes before?
It was before.
So in the last 3 years, did you not get any flashes of recognition?
I didn't. I think there comes a time as they get toward the end, and they live. They live for who knows how long. My mother was healthy, and I knew this is going to go on for a while, but toward the end, they just become quieter. At least, okay, I should say my mother. She became quieter, less involved, less engaged, inwardly focused. She had a baby doll that she loved, and it was always on her lap. She had wooden puzzles that they would put on a tray in front of her, and she would jiggle them. They were for toddlers, and she loved them. She had a stuffed cat that purred. It was a battery-operated cat. She petted that endlessly. That was how she spent her last 3 years.
And I'm pretty sure you're adopted, is that right?
I am. All three of us are.
Yeah. Did that have any impact on how you related to her as you were going through all of this?
Not one bit. I was adopted as a baby.
Wow.
She was my mother, my mom and my dad. There's not one bit of difference that I could imagine, except maybe in the back of my mind on my worst days, I was relieved that I was adopted, and that if there is a hereditary gene for dementia,
Yeah,
I wasn't going to
you
have
don't
this.
have it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was. It's what occurred to me as well. That yes, out of everything, you don't have that fear.
Right. Thank you,
do
Mom.
you? Because I think for a lot of people that is the fear.
Yeah.
Because it is something hereditary.
Yes.
So what do you say to people who are listening to this and who are thinking, well, my situation is completely different?
I say that all situations are different. But if you're with somebody, if you're caring for somebody with dementia, there are common foundational lines there. And you are going to experience things. You're going to experience things they say that don't make sense, behaviors that they exhibit that are unbecoming of them. I can't tell you what they will be, but they will be there. And I will say that your time with them is limited. It doesn't have, or it does have, an expiration date. We can't predict what it is. But when that expiration date comes, there is nothing to prepare you for the feeling of, I want one do-over. I wish I had handled that situation differently. I'm going to do it next time. But you may not get that next time. And I think when I typed the end, I thought I was writing the book to help people get through it. And I was, and I have. But what I really, really think I wanted to do now, as I look back, is help people gain the opportunity to change their attitude so that they don't regret the attitude that they may have adopted as they're caring for this very difficult person. This person who doesn't look anything like the person you remember, who doesn't act anything like them, who is testing your every ounce of patience. And as you're caregiving, as you're taking care of their needs, you become resentful. You can't help it. There will be days. And that resentment is something you'll always feel. You'll remember it. And if you can change how you feel about it, find humor, dig that love, that you have for them out from down deep. If you can do that, I think you're going to stand a much better chance of not having this huge regret when they go.
And I think that applies to just looking after older parents, whether or not there's any dementia there, because I think older people do get frustrating from younger people's perspective sometimes, and there's a stubbornness even if there's no dementia.
What a good
And
point.
there's I certainly see that in
Right.
my mum, bless her. She
Sure.
won't be listening to this podcast, I don't think. But there's a denial, there's a not wanting to have help,
Right.
there's a stubbornness,
Right. And
all of those things.
and you become this caregiver and you're the taskmaster. You have to pick up after them now. You might have to cook for them now. You might have to help them bathe. And to find humor in that, and to find love in that. While you're busy, I mean, they're taking time away from your family. They're taking time away from your work. You might have had to call in sick one day because your mother needed you for something that you were the only person that could help her with. It's hard not to feel righteous, indignant.
Mm.
So, but
But if that ever happens to me, then I will feel guilty for two things. One, because it's my mom we're talking about, but also because there are a lot of people who don't see their parents get into older age.
Right.
A lot of people who lose their parents when they're much younger. And I think as much as you can, yes, appreciate the time you have left, however the time itself is, I think that's very powerful. And I think that's certainly something that comes through in your book, because you weren't even getting recognition for 3 years, and you continued to love and care and be there for this person who didn't even know you anymore. So I think that's really, really powerful.
yeah, and the 5 years before that, I was getting blamed.
Yeah.
Yeah, when she did
So you had
recognize me.
8 years.
Yeah.
Oh my
I was
goodness.
the bad daughter. I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
I was
yeah.
told that so many times, how disappointing I was to her and how much I had let her down, and where did she go wrong raising me.
And yet you were the one that was there,
was the
weren't
that
you? You were the one
spent
doing
those
the
8 years.
caring.
Yes. Yes.
So what's one thing that you hope people take away from reading your book?
Don't worry about how much you mess up. Just show up. Show up every day. Be there for them. Of course I could go on. That's one, but I would love to add to that. Be there for them and be happy you're there. Consider it a gift if you can find that, within
Yeah.
yourself.
That's very, very powerful. Yeah, because it is a gift. It is a gift because it's still time with your parent, however they are,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is. They can, they can be cruel and they can make it hard on you, and it will be a test, of your patience and kindness and I don't know, perseverance, all of the things. But like you just said, they are your parent, and they were running after you when you were toddling and getting into messes and making all of your mistakes and your tantrums and all of the things.
And what advice would you give to someone who is just starting out on this path with their loved ones?
Research, read books, go online. I didn't have the online experience in 2012. It was there, but not to the extent by any means that it is now. Go online. I have online groups in the back of my book that you can look up, and there are many more. Google, dementia caregiving help. You need to arm yourself with as much information and education as you can, because I don't think there's anything that can prepare you for this.
No. Although reading books like yours is
Right.
definitely going to
Read
help.
a book, read my book. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are others. In fact, there are so many more now. I wish they were there when I was looking for them. And I thought of that when I wrote this book. But again, we all have a different take. We all have a different story to tell. We all have a different way of telling it. And that's what I think makes my book unique.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree. I think it's very unique, and it's just really, really well written, and it's a great read. So, what did you learn about yourself from writing the book?
What I learned to do mostly is I learned that I don't need to always be right. You said that in the very beginning of this podcast. And I kind of inwardly chuckled, because that is something that I learned. And I think inherently we have that within ourselves. We want to be heard. We want to be right if we think we're right. And we want to make sure that is told. And that was the big lesson for me, that the joke doesn't have to be told the exact same way you told it. The dinner plans don't have to go exactly the way you envisioned them to go. It's more about how you want the end result to be. So I think that was a big thing that I learned, that just try to flow.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife: Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.